There's something I need to show you. Debt. Right now there's this country, not too tiny, with a GDP of $80 billion, that's about a quarter of Singapore's. This country has gone into default for the first time in history. I'm talking about Sri Lanka. Right now, Sri Lanka is in a mess. There's no money for fuel, there's not enough food. People are queuing up for days just to get gas supplies. That is a very sad situation. But why are they in such a bad predicament? Let's look a bit back on their history. This chart really shows that their debt to GDP has grown significantly over the last 10-15 years. You see that actually after the global financial crisis of 2008, the debt amount has climbed exponentially. And actually if you scrutinize a bit more, you realize that there's a second climb around 2013-2014. And that's actually when President Xi Jinping of China was elected. Now what's going on exactly in Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka has been running a deficit for years and they've been exporting way less than they have been importing. And they have sustained this imbalance simply through debt. And to simplify it in terms of personal finance, what that means is that you are spending more money than your income. Which means sooner or later, you are only able to make minimums on your credit card bill. And eventually, you can't even have enough money to make the minimums. That is where actually Sri Lanka is right now. They are in severe debt and they've ran out of money to even buy fuel and gas. That is a sad situation. And I'll start this discussion because just now I mentioned about Xi Jinping and China's debt to Sri Lanka. If you scrutinize, you realize that China owns about 10% of Sri Lanka's total foreign debt. And Xi Jinping has mentioned before that China is keen to build this Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. And BRI actually invests into ports, roads, railways, infrastructure projects. Later I'll show you a bit from Sri Lanka. And the whole Chinese pitch has been, if you lack roads, bridges, railways, power stations, we'll build it for you. We'll lend you the money. We'll give you the know-how on how to build it. And we are a friendly investor. And that has brought many countries, including Sri Lanka, to become dependent on Chinese investments. Now it's quite clear to us all as observers, this is quite possibly a political game. Because if you see what kind of investments China has made in Sri Lanka, the first is this tower over here called Lotus Tower. Now this is a grand tower, correct? And Lotus, quite obviously, it has a lot of Chinese influence to things. This tower was constructed by National Electronics Importers and Exporters Corporation of China, CEIEC. And the loans have been coming from these state-owned companies. And this majestic Lotus Tower is facing the Beira Lake in Colombo. And the main sources of revenue is from tourism and leasing of transmission antennas. Now, quite obviously with COVID, the tourism industry in Sri Lanka has been wiped out, correct? So this mega project has been a loss maker. And quite obviously, China can stomach loss-making projects, but not so for Sri Lanka. China has a second major project in Sri Lanka, which is the Hambantota Port. This port was built in 2010 with $1.5 billion. Now this venture was considered economically unviable, and indeed in the next few years, this port sat empty and neglected. This caused Sri Lanka's debt to balloon up considerably. But all this was swept under the carpet because as you can see in this image over here, there were posters that welcomed Chinese investments. Eventually, Sri Lanka ran out of money to repay that loan. That is why Chinese government in 2017 actually negotiated to get exclusive rights of this port for 99 years. And to many in the West, it is viewed as an infringement of sovereignty. And not just that, China has a special agreement that stipulated a 15,000 acre special economic zone right in Sri Lanka. Now the question is, with China in its own debt turmoil right now, where are future investments going to come? Because the good old days of China investing into foreign countries seem to have passed. Let's look at this map over here. You realize that China's investment is not only in Sri Lanka, they also have investment in Malaysia and Cambodia, which are neighboring countries, as well as many Arabian countries. There's also a small country in the left called Djibouti, which I'll touch on in a quick while. There are actually more Chinese-backed ports if you zoom out a bit. You realize that their ports span all over the world, including western side of Africa. Now in the report, China is owed $385 billion. And that is all for many poor developing countries. This Belt and Road Initiative seems to be on paper friendly investments into countries for their political goodwill as well as their resources. But that also means that many countries are indebted to China. Just now I mentioned Djibouti. The debt of this country is 70% of its GDP and is clearly not sustainable. So the question is this incident that's happening right now in Sri Lanka isolated? Would there be a knockdown effect on all developing countries and eventually it will catch up also with the developed world? Let's look at some reports. IMF and World Bank has flagged out that many economies are in trouble. They face three key risks. The first is rising food prices. The second is rising energy prices. I've called for oil to go $150. And if that were to come true, that would put even further strain on these economies. These two are big contributors to inflation, and as PMD has mentioned, inflation could become a very serious problem if measures are not taken. Now, I'll actually be doing a follow-up video on recession because PMD has actually mentioned something about recession also. So if you're keen for the topic, smash or subscribe. I'll be covering it very shortly. The third is tightening financial conditions, and as we know, Fed is raising interest rates rapidly. And if the borrowing cost in US is 3%, you can imagine that the borrowing cost in Djibouti has to be 23%. As forecasted in this image over here, 69 countries face all three of these risks. 19 of them are in Latin America, 25 are in Africa, and 25 are in Asia Pacific. And since you follow me to here, I would like to leave a name as to somebody that might be in trouble next. That nation is quite likely Egypt. If you look, Egypt imports a lot of wheat from Russia and Ukraine. And they've reported also that they are only left with 3 months worth of wheat stock. There is a huge population over there, and GDP of Egypt is way bigger than Sri Lanka, and it also has a sizable population. Egypt and Sri Lanka are just representatives and possibly tip of the iceberg in this whole debt storm. If you see over here, emerging economies, how much they have in terms of debt have climbed up ever since global financial crisis. And the poorest of the poor nations simply cannot deal with hyperinflation. But what about the developed world? You realize that China is more leveraged than ever on the right hand side of this chart, and advanced economies, which includes US, have also seen an increase in debt. So my question to you today is, will this have a domino effect? Developing countries are the first to fall. Subsequently, developed economies are also hurt. There's going to be hyperinflation that starts off in developing economies. They're going to face high unemployment rates, and for the foreseeable year or two ahead, there's just going to be lack of investments simply because China is slowing down and the cheap debt in global economies are just drying up right before our very eyes. This could be the start of the debt storm that is coming. If you agree and have benefited, smash the like button so we can reach a bigger audience together, because I brought you this message way earlier than many in mainstream media, and I believe that there is every reason to approach investments cautiously even if we see a quick bounce in the next few weeks ahead. And since you stuck with me to the end of this presentation, I have a few new promotions which I'll leave in the summary sections below. Check them out because they can help you in your investment journey. With that, I'll sign off from here. Thank you for watching, invest safe, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care and goodbye.